Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and support me. In the not-so-distant future, the limits of human exploration seem to have been reached. For centuries, the speed of light was considered an unbreakable boundary, a law of the universe as immutable as time itself. But with relentless determination and the brilliance of a select few, humanity had finally found a way to breach this barrier. The breakthrough wasn't just scientific, it was a leap into the unknown, a bold stride beyond the confines of the possible. Mark Holden, a young astronaut known for his exceptional skills and unyielding courage, found himself at the forefront of this historic mission. Chosen from thousands, Mark embodied the perfect blend of intellect and bravery. As he stood in the launch bay, gazing at the massive structure of the Menace, the spaceship that would take them beyond the limits of light, a thrill of anticipation mixed with an undercurrent of unease coursed through him. He had spent years preparing for this moment, yet the magnitude of the unknown made even the most seasoned astronauts apprehensive. The Menace was a marvel of human engineering, designed to withstand the pressures of faster-than-light travel. Its sleek, metallic exterior housed advanced technologies that defied conventional physics. As Mark and the crew took their positions, the air inside the control room was thick with anticipation. They had trained for every possible scenario, but deep down, they all knew that once they crossed the threshold into faster-than-light travel, they would be venturing into completely uncharted territory. With the final checks complete, the Lumine's engines roared to life, the hum of power vibrating through the entire ship. Mark's heart raced as the countdown began. 3, 2, 1, the ship lurched forward, and the stars outside the viewport began to blur, stretching into long lines of light as the Menace accelerated to speeds no human had ever experienced. At first, there was only the exhilaration of breaking the speed barrier. The crew cheered as the ship pushed beyond the constraints of conventional space travel. The familiar view of the cosmos was replaced by a tunnel of swirling lights, a kaleidoscope of colors that defied description. Mark felt the immense force of acceleration pressing him into his seat, but it was a small price to pay for the experience of traveling faster than light. But as the ship continued to accelerate, the exhilaration gave way to something more unsettling. The view outside the ship became increasingly distorted, the once sharp lines of starlight now twisting into chaotic spirals. The instruments on the control panel began to flicker and glitch, displaying readings that made no sense. The once familiar hum of the engines was now punctuated by strange, irregular pulses, like the heartbeat of something alive. It wasn't long before the crew began to notice that something was terribly wrong. The ship, which should have been gliding smoothly through space, was now shuddering intermittently. Objects in the cabin started to float, defying gravity in a way that wasn't part of the mission plan. The artificial gravity systems were failing, and more disturbingly, time itself seemed to be losing coherence. The seconds stretched and compressed, with moments of disorienting clarity followed by periods of confusion. Mark's initial unease deepened into a cold dread. He could feel the effects of the anomaly that had engulfed the Menace. His thoughts began to scatter, memories blending together in a confusing swirl of images and sensations. The voices of his fellow crew members grew distant, distorted, as if they were coming from a great distance. Reality, once a solid and reliable construct, was now slipping through his fingers like sand. Desperate to regain control, Mark forced himself to focus on the task at hand. He had to stabilize the ship, find a way to navigate out of this strange dimension they had entered. But as he tried to communicate with the rest of the crew, he realized that they too were being affected. Commander Richards, usually a model of calm and control, was frantically adjusting controls that no longer responded as they should. His eyes darted around the cabin, wide with panic. "Mark, do you copy?" Richard's voice crackled through the comms, distorted and barely recognizable. Mark reached for the controls, trying to adjust the ship's trajectory, but the feedback from the systems was erratic. The Menace was no longer under their control. It was as if the ship had been swallowed by an alien force, one that obeyed no known laws of physics. As minutes stretched into what felt like hours, the situation grew increasingly dire. The crew began to experience hallucinations, seeing things that weren't there, hearing voices from their pasts. Mark saw the faces of long-lost friends, heard the echoes of conversations he had forgotten. It was as if this dimension was toying with their minds, warping their perceptions and eroding their grasp on reality. Amidst the chaos, Mark realized that they had to find a way out before they lost themselves completely. The Luminous was equipped with a prototype navigation system designed to handle extreme conditions, but it was never tested for something like this. He had to take a risk. With trembling hands, he accessed the emergency override, inputting a sequence that would attempt to reverse the ship's trajectory, pulling them back from the brink of this twisted dimension. The ship groaned in protest as the engines fired up in reverse. Mark could feel the strain on the hull, the metal creaking as the Luminous fought against the forces that held it captive. The view outside the ship began to shift, the chaotic spirals of light gradually giving way to the more familiar starfield of their home dimension. For a moment, it seemed like they might make it, but the dimension wasn't willing to let them go so easily. The ship was violently wrenched to the side, throwing Mark and the crew against their restraints. A blinding light filled the cabin, and Mark felt a searing pain in his head, as if his mind was being pulled apart. The ship's systems began to fail one by one, the lights flickering and then going out completely. They were plunged into darkness, the only sound the ragged breathing of the crew. When the light finally subsided, Mark found himself floating in the cabin, weightless and disoriented. The ship was still, eerily quiet. He glanced around at the others, seeing the same look of shock and confusion on their faces. They had escaped the dimension, but at what cost? The instruments were dead, the engines silent. They were adrift in space, no way to navigate, no way to communicate. In the days that followed, the crew tried to piece together what had happened, but their memories were fragmented, incomplete. Some spoke of visions, of being visited by beings of light, others of dark, shadowy figures. No two accounts were the same. The experience had left its mark on them all, not just mentally, but physically. Mark noticed changes in his perception, the way his mind processed information. It was as if part of him was still connected to that other dimension, still feeling its influence. As they drifted through space, their supplies dwindling, hope began to fade. The vast emptiness of the universe surrounded them, a constant reminder of their isolation. But Mark refused to give up. He knew that they couldn't just sit and wait for death. There had to be a way to make contact, to find their way back. In a final act of desperation, Mark rigged the ship's remaining power supply to send out a distress signal, a beacon that would broadcast their location to any nearby ships. It was a long shot, but it was all they had left. As the signal pulsed into the void, Mark sat back, exhausted, and watched the stars outside the viewport. They were back in their own dimension, but the experience had changed them all. The journey beyond Lightspeed had taken them to the edge of reality and beyond, leaving them forever altered. Eventually, the signal was picked up by a passing exploration vessel, and the crew of the Luminous was rescued. But the men and women who returned were not the same as those who had left. They had glimpsed something beyond the veil of the universe, something that defied comprehension. The world they returned to seemed smaller, less significant, after what they had experienced. For Mark, the journey didn't end with their rescue. The memories of that other dimension, the visions and the strange sensations, lingered in his mind, a constant reminder of the unknown that lay beyond the speed of light. He had survived, but he knew that a part of him would always be searching for answers, always yearning to understand what they had encountered. As he stood on the observation deck of the space station, looking out at the stars, Mark knew that humanity's exploration of the universe had only just begun. The breakthrough they had made was just the first step into a much larger, more mysterious cosmos. And though the journey had cost them dearly, it had also opened their eyes to the infinite possibilities that lay beyond the limits of light. The stars twinkled in the darkness, each one a distant world, a potential adventure waiting to be discovered. Mark took a deep breath, steeling himself for whatever challenges lay ahead. He had crossed the threshold into the unknown and returned, but he knew that the journey was far from over. As he walked away from the viewport, he felt a strange mix of hope and trepidation. The universe was vast and unpredictable, filled with wonders and dangers beyond imagination. But Mark was ready. He had faced the unknown and survived. And as long as there were stars in the sky, he knew that he would keep pushing the boundaries, keep exploring the uncharted territories of the cosmos, because beyond Lightspeed, beyond the limits of what was known, there was an entire universe waiting to be discovered. Mark Holden stepped away from the viewport, the vastness of space still lingering in his thoughts. The Luminous had been to the edge of reality and back, and while they had returned, the experience had left its mark on everyone aboard. The rescue vessel had brought them back to civilization, but as Mark looked around the space station, everything felt oddly distant, as if the world he had returned to was a mere echo of the one he had left behind. The crew of the Luminous had been debriefed extensively by the authorities. Endless hours of questioning, physical examinations, and psychological evaluations filled their days. Each crewmember's account of the journey beyond Lightspeed varied wildly, yet none of them could fully articulate what they had experienced in that other dimension. The scientists and officials listened, their expressions carefully neutral, but Mark could tell that they were baffled, unable to comprehend the full scope of what had happened. Mark found himself alone in his quarters, the sterile environment of the station contrasting sharply with the chaotic, mind-bending dimension they had escaped. His thoughts drifted back to the moment when they had crossed the threshold into faster-than-light travel, the exhilaration that had quickly turned to terror as the ship was consumed by the anomaly. He closed his eyes, trying to recall the details of what he had seen, what he had felt, but the memories were fragmented, like pieces of a puzzle that no longer fit together. He wasn't the only one struggling. The other crew members were grappling with their own demons, each affected in ways they could barely understand, let alone explain. Commander Richards, once a pillar of strength and authority, had withdrawn into himself, rarely speaking except when necessary. Dr. Elena Vargas, the ship's medical officer, had taken to compulsively checking the medical logs, as if hoping to find some explanation hidden in the data. The normally cheerful engineer, Sam Kepler, had developed a nervous twitch, his hands constantly moving as if adjusting controls that weren't there. Mark knew that whatever had happened to them out there, it wasn't something they could easily shake off. The debriefings, the medical tests, and the psychological evaluations all felt like superficial attempts to address a much deeper wound. The truth was, they had glimpsed something far beyond human understanding, and the impact of that revelation was still settling into their minds. One night, unable to sleep, Mark found himself back at the observation deck. The stars outside were a comforting constant, a reminder that despite everything, the universe still operated according to its own rules. But as he stared into the void, he couldn't shake the feeling that those rules weren't as absolute as he once believed. A soft chime alerted him to the presence of someone else. He turned to see Dr. Vargas stepping onto the deck, her usually composed demeanor showing signs of wear. Her eyes met his, and without a word, she joined him by the viewport. "Can't sleep either?" Mark asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Elena shook her head, her gaze fixed on the stars. "Every time I close my eyes, I see flashes of something. I don't even know how to describe it. It's like my mind is trying to piece together what happened, but the pieces don't fit." Mark nodded, understanding all too well. "It's the same for me. Every time I think I've got a handle on it, the memories just slip away, or they change into something else entirely." They stood in silence for a while, the weight of their shared experience hanging in the air between them. Finally, Elena spoke again, her voice tinged with a mix of frustration and curiosity. "Do you think they'll ever let us go back out there? To explore it again?" Mark considered her question carefully. Part of him recoiled at the thought of returning to that place, but another part, the part that had driven him to become an astronaut in the first place, was intrigued by the idea. There was still so much they didn't understand, so much that needed to be uncovered. "I don't know," he admitted. "But if they do, I think we'd have to be better prepared. We were lucky to get out of there alive. Next time, well, who knows if there'll even be a next time." Elena sighed, her breath fogging the glass of the viewport slightly. "It's funny, isn't it? We're supposed to be the pioneers, the ones who push the boundaries, and yet I feel like we've barely scratched the surface." Mark knew what she meant. They had crossed the threshold into a new frontier, but instead of conquering it, they had been overwhelmed, almost consumed by it. The experience had humbled them, shown them just how little they truly understood about the universe and their place in it. They stood there, lost in their thoughts. The comms unit on Mark's belt buzzed to life. He unclipped it, glancing at the small screen. "Holden, report to the command center." Immediately. The message was brief, but the urgency in the voice was unmistakable. Mark exchanged a glance with Elena, who gave him a small nod. Without a word, they both turned and headed toward the command center, their footsteps echoing in the empty corridors of the station. When they arrived, the room was a hive of activity. Officers and technicians were huddled around the central display, where a large holographic map of the sector was projected. Mark immediately noticed that a section of the map was highlighted in red, pulsing ominously. "What's going on?" Mark asked as he approached one of the officers. The officer turned to him, his expression grim. "We've detected an anomaly. Similar to the one that pulled the Menace into that other dimension. But this one is much larger, and it's moving." Mark felt a chill run down his spine. Moving? Toward what? The officer pointed to the map, where a series of trajectories were being plotted in real time. "Toward us. If the calculations are correct, it'll intersect with this station in less than 48 hours. A silence fell over the room as everyone processed the implications. The station wasn't equipped to deal with something like this. They had barely survived the first encounter, and now it seemed like the anomaly was coming for them, deliberately or otherwise. Mark's mind raced as he tried to think of a way out. The Menace was still docked at the station, but it was in no condition to fly, let alone withstand another journey into the unknown. And even if they could escape, where would they go? The anomaly was too large, too unpredictable. "It could follow them anywhere. We need to evacuate." Commander Richard's voice cut through the tension, bringing everyone's attention back to the present. He was standing at the head of the room, his usual calm authority reasserting itself. "Start prepping the shuttles. We can't risk staying here any longer." Mark opened his mouth to agree, but then something stopped him. A memory, a fragment of what they had experienced in the anomaly. He couldn't quite place it, but there was a feeling, a sense that running wouldn't solve anything. The anomaly wasn't just a random phenomenon. It was deliberate, perhaps even intelligent. "Wait," he said, his voice steadying as the idea took shape. "What if we're supposed to face it? What if running is exactly what it wants us to do?" The room went quiet as everyone turned to look at him. Commander Richards frowned. "What are you suggesting, Holden?" Mark took a deep breath. "When we were in that dimension, it felt like it was trying to communicate with us, or at least test us. If we just run, we're playing into its hands. But if we confront it, maybe we can learn something, find a way to stop it." Richard stared at him for a long moment, the gears turning in his mind. Finally, he nodded slowly. "You may be right. But how do you propose we confront something like that?" Mark glanced at Elena, who gave him an encouraging nod. "We use the Menace. It's already been through this once, and it's the only ship equipped with the tech we need to even attempt this. If we can modify the engines, maybe we can stabilize the anomaly, or at least get some answers." It was a gamble, and they all knew it. The odds were slim, the risks enormous. But the alternative was certain destruction. The room was silent as everyone weighed the options. "All right," Richards finally said. "Do it. But you're on a tight schedule. If this doesn't work, we're out of here, no exceptions." Mark nodded, already running through the list of modifications they would need to make. He felt a surge of determination. This was their chance to do more than just survive. They could make a difference, perhaps even prevent the anomaly from threatening others in the future. The next 24 hours were a blur of activity. The crew worked tirelessly, modifying the Lumini's engines, recalibrating the sensors, and reinforcing the hull. Mark barely slept, his mind focused on the task at hand. Elena was by his side the entire time, her expertise invaluable as they prepared the ship for what could very well be its final mission. As the clock ticked down, the station's corridors buzzed with tension. Those who weren't directly involved in the mission prepared for evacuation, but there was an unspoken understanding that they were placing their hopes in the Luminous and its crew. Mark felt the weight of their expectations, but he also felt a sense of purpose. This was why he had become an astronaut, why he had chosen a life of exploration and discovery. When the time finally came, the crew of the Luminous boarded the ship, the familiar hum of the engines filling the cabin as they powered up. Mark took his place at the helm, his fingers steady on the controls. This time, they weren't just venturing into the unknown. They were doing it with a plan, a purpose. As the Luminous detached from the station and began its approach toward the anomaly, the tension in the cabin was palpable. The anomaly was visible now, a swirling vortex of light and shadow that defied description. It was beautiful in a terrifying way, a reminder of the vast, untamed forces at play in the universe. Engaging FTL drive, Mark announced, his voice calm despite the adrenaline coursing through him. The ship lurched as the engines kicked in, the familiar sensation of acceleration pressing them into their seats. The anomaly loomed larger and larger on the view screen, until it filled their entire field of vision. The ship's systems began to fluctuate, the same erratic behavior they had experienced before. But this time, Mark was ready. He adjusted the controls, stabilizing the ship as it was pulled into the heart of the vortex. The transition was smoother than before, the ship passing through the threshold with only a slight tremor. But as they entered the anomaly, the familiar sense of disorientation returned. The viewscreen was filled with swirling colors, the laws of physics once again bending and warping around them. "Hold steady," Mark called out, his voice the anchor that kept the crew focused. They had a plan, and they had to stick to it. He activated the modified sensors, hoping to find some pattern, some clue as to the anomaly's nature. The data began to stream in, but it was unlike anything they had seen before. The readings were nonsensical, a jumble of information that defied analysis. Mark frowned, trying to make sense of it, but his mind felt sluggish, as if the anomaly was affecting his thoughts. Elena's voice broke through the haze. "Mark, look at this." She pointed to a section of the data stream, where a series of signals were repeating, faint but distinct. Mark stared at the screen, realization dawning. The signals were a pattern, a code. Someone, or something, was trying to communicate with them. "Boost the signal," he ordered, his fingers flying over the controls. The ship's systems responded, amplifying the faint signals until they were clear enough to analyze. The message was simple, but chilling. A single word, repeated over and over: warning. Mark's heart raced as he processed the implications. The anomaly wasn't just a random phenomenon. It was a warning, a barrier meant to keep something out, or perhaps, to keep them in. "We need to get out of here," Elena said, her voice urgent. "Now." But as Mark reached for the controls, the ship shuddered violently, the view screen filling with blinding light. The anomaly was reacting to their presence, its forces closing in around them. "They were out of time, brace yourselves," Mark shouted as he activated the emergency protocols. The Lumini's engines roared to life, straining against the overwhelming forces. The ship groaned under the pressure, but Mark refused to give up. They had come too far to fail now. With a final surge of power, the Luminous broke free, the vortex of the anomaly receding behind them as they hurtled back into normal space. The view screen cleared, revealing the familiar starfield of their home dimension. The crew let out a collective breath, the tension finally breaking. They had survived, but the message they had received echoed in their minds. Mark sat back in his seat, exhaustion washing over him. They had confronted the unknown and come back with more questions than answers. But one thing was clear: the universe was far more dangerous and mysterious than they had ever imagined. As the Luminous docked back at the station, Mark knew that their journey was far from over. The warning they had received was just the beginning. There was something out there, something powerful enough to bend reality itself, and it was only a matter of time before they would have to face it again. but for now, they had survived. And that was enough.